Test, test. Committee will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare a recess at any time pursuant to Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11. The chair may postpone further proceedings on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote on the yeas and nays are ordered. Our first item for consideration is H.R. 5381, the Greater Act of 2018. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5381 to reduce and minimize the credit, guarantee, and insurance risk of all Federal Government programs by transferring such risk to the private sector at market terms and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Florida and the co-sponsor of the bill, my friend Mr. Ross, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5381 offered by Mr. Ross of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to begin by thanking Mr. Royce of California for his great work on this legislation and leadership on the issue of risk management at the Federal level. It's been a pleasure working with him on H.R. 5381, and I'm proud to be shepherding this important legislation through the committee today. The Greater Act, H.R. 5381, requires government agencies to explore opportunities for involving private market risk sharing in government credit, insurance, and loan guarantee programs. The government holds different risks in more than a dozen programs that extend credit or insurance or provide a government guarantee. These programs include Federal Student Loan Program, Flood Insurance Program, Federal Housing Administration Loan Program, and Small Business Loan Programs. Each of these programs serves a vital function, but they also expose taxpayers to a significant risk of loss. For example, in fiscal year 2017, the Federal Student Loan Program had $1.4 trillion in loans outstanding to 43 million borrowers. In 2016, the Flood Insurance Program provided $1.28 trillion of insurance coverage to over 5 million households. Today, the flood program still has a debt of over $20 billion, not counting losses from Hurricane Florence. The flood insurance program also operates a successful but new pilot program to share risk with the private market. In 2017, the flood insurance program transferred $1 billion of the program's flood risk to the private insurance market. But despite these successes, the program had a lot of uncertainty. FEMA officials running the program reported they had little knowledge of experience when they first approached capital markets for coverage, nor could any of the government officials assist FEMA in the process because they were the first ones out of the gate. While the flood insurance program has been successful and other agencies face similar challenges of not having the knowledge or guidance to implement their own risk-sharing programs, the Greater Act aims to fill this void by encouraging a government-wide approach to involving private markets to share some of the risks of these programs. If a program could use private market solutions to save taxpayers money and reduce exposure to loss, the agency is directed to report on how such products would be used and estimate any upfront costs. Under this legislation, the Office of Management and Budget then reports to Congress every 5 years about the status of private risk sharing across the Federal Government. OMB is also responsible for coordinating policies across agencies who utilize the private market to save taxpayers money. Lastly, H.R. 5381, or this amendment, provides agencies the discretion to utilize private sector risk sharing if so doing is consistent with existing law. Importantly, this legislation does not mandate the use of any private sector risk management tool. It merely requires agencies to identify programs that might benefit from that incorporation. In addition, the annual reporting requirement of the bill ensures Congress can debate the merits of each of these investments and identify policy changes to ensure they function in a fiscally responsible way. Again, the Greater Act does not affect how the current programs operate or make any policy changes contemplated by other congressional authorizing committees. This bill is a first step to analyzing the feasibility of Federal programs using private market solutions to save money for taxpayers. We need to get smarter as to how we manage risk at the Federal level. The Greater Act is a step in the right direction, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Would my friend yield?
Yes.
I just wanted to say on a personal note, thank you for yielding. I think this may be one of your last markups here at the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. And I want to just tell you, I value your friendship and I value your contribution. We don't always agree, but you've always been a gentleman, and I'm going to miss you. And I wish you all the best in the next chapter of your career.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I truly appreciate that. Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
I want to I share the words of my colleague, Mr. Connolly, and it has been a privilege to work with you, and I really mean that. You've always been a gentleman to me, and you've always shown the highest level of bipartisanship with me, and I appreciate that. But on your way out,
Don't change a thing.
I strongly oppose H.R. 5381, the Greater Act, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The substitute amendment is extremely broad and would make substantial changes to the reinsurance authority of every federal agency. It would make it the policy of the federal government to transfer credit, guarantee, or insurance risks to the private sector instead of ensuring taxpayer savings and sustainable communities. This measure raises serious concerns about the one-size-fits-all approach to addressing insurance for government programs. It would require each and every agency that administers a credit, guarantee, or insurance program to create and carry out a plan to transfer the risk to the private sector. By requiring that agencies establish plans with the goal of privatizing such programs, the bill would take away the ability of expert career officials to create a truly balanced assessment of its programs. Requiring federal government agencies to take the more expensive route of paying for private reinsurance would mean that taxpayers would have to bear the brunt of these costs through higher premium charges. This is the opposite of encouraging taxpayer savings and could undermine efforts to maintain stable communities. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that a letter from multiple organizations, including the Americans for Financial Reform, Center for Responsible Lending, and the Consumer Federation of America, be entered into the record.
Without objection.
That letter states, in part, and I quote, "The sweeping mandate to transfer all risks to the private sector in H.R. 5381 is misguided, and it appears designed more to benefit financial intermediaries who want federal government business than it is to benefit taxpayers or the public," end of quote. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this legislation, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is recorded vote is ordered as previously announced. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. The question is now on favorably reporting. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6891, the anti-deficiency.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I seek recognition for a motion before we move to the next piece of legislation.
I can't recognize you for that because that's not on the agenda, but I think you
would
may
ask to
want to
be
speak
heard.
on the, yeah, okay.
So we're not interrupting your other business.
Yes, sir.
I thank the chair. I asked, Mr. Chairman, today that our committee be allowed to debate and vote on 11 subpoena motions involving multiple agencies and issues. Ranking Member Cummings and I summarized each of these requests in a letter to you, Mr. Chairman, on Tuesday. The subpoena motions I would be seeking today span a variety of topics that are key to our ability to conduct oversight. For example, our committee oversees the 2020 census, and Secretary Ross has provided what many believe is misleading testimony to multiple committees of Congress in the House and the Senate about a very momentous decision, the decision to add an untested citizenship question to the census. This committee has an obligation, since it's the committee of jurisdiction, to understand whether that decision will have an impact on compliance and costs with respect to the all-important 2020 census. Secretary Ross said that he was, and I quote, responding solely to the Department of Justice request. But new documents, as we now know, indicate that the Secretary, in fact, engaged in secretive, behind-the-scenes campaign to enlist several agencies in his effort to orchestrate the addition of the citizenship request at his own initiative. We asked Secretary Ross to clarify his testimony, but he's ignored us. We need to bring the Secretary of Commerce here before this committee in a hearing, open, so that our members and the public can understand and our members question directly Secretary under oath. In another example, Mr. Chairman, all of the Democratic members of this committee raised concerns that the White House has entirely ignored the federal law that requires it to produce to this committee a report about its security clearance processes. The law is one we passed in this committee, the Secret Act, but this committee and the full House passed H.R. 32110 by voice vote. The Senate passed it unanimously, and the President signed it into law in May. Yet, that same President is just ignoring the law, disregarding it, and refusing to produce the report that law requires. As with each prior motion, we've already written letters explaining our requests. We explained why the documents and testimony are critical to oversight efforts here in this committee. So now, we ask, in fairness, that the full committee be given the opportunity to vote on these subpoenas as allowed under committee rules. If we cannot obtain the documents and the testimony we seek, we will be unable to conduct the vigorous oversight the American people elected us to perform. Today marks the sixth, that we Democrats have asked during business meetings to let our committee vote on subpoenas covering issues of critical importance to the American people. The past 5 motions were ruled out of order. I have no doubt this one will be too. The committee, as a result, had no opportunity to debate or vote on the motions. I would ask for a different result today. I hereby move that this committee authorize and issue subpoenas for the documents and testimony on the 11 topics described in Ranking Member Cummings and my letter to you, Mr. Chairman, on Tuesday, September 25th, 2018, and the motion is before the clerk's desk.
Gentleman yield.
I would so move.
I second the motion.
Of course I'd yield.
Mr. Chairman, I want to second the motion and associate myself with Mr. Connolly's statements. Mr. Chairman, we supported you in issuing your first subpoena this past month. It was a subpoena to a Department of Homeland Security attorney for a deposition, and we appreciate that. We agreed that we needed to talk to that attorney about the decision to withhold documents about TSA whistleblowers who reported security concerns. I worked with our chairman, Chairman Chaffetz, to issue a subpoena for these documents. We supported those actions because when the executive branch refuses to provide us the information that we need, this committee must use its authority to obtain that information. Democratic members have asked for you to issue on, or at least let us vote on, more than 60 other subpoenas since you have been chairman, and you have blocked all of them. In those cases, like with DHS attorney, the Trump administration has been openly denying our requests with absolutely no repercussions, and many of these requests have been bipartisan. They started with a Republican co-signer, but the Trump administration still refused. I believe we should be conducting vigorous oversight of the executive branch. It is our job. It's our constitutional duty. Without rigorous oversight, without that constitutional check, we have already seen how members of the Trump administration have become mired in scandal, wasted taxpayer money, and abused their authority. I ask that you reconsider your decision to block our oversight efforts and just let us take a vote on issuing those subpoenas. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back to my friend from Virginia and my friend from Maryland. To the extent I interpret your comments as a motion for a subpoena or a motion to add an item to the agenda is set, and it cannot be changed once the meeting has begun. So with that, our next item for consideration is H.R. 6891, the anti-deficiency.
Put on your mic.
Sorry. Mr. Chairman, I didn't understand. Are you making a ruling?
Well, I can't make a ruling because it's not on the agenda. If you're asking me to add it to the agenda, I can't add it to the agenda after the meeting has begun. So,
Is there not a motion at the desk?
is there a motion? I don't believe so. The gentleman was not recognized for a motion.
I understand that, but I thought there was a motion at the desk. Is there not? Well, let me ask clarification of the chairman. The chairman is stating that given the fact that it wasn't on the agenda, and given the fact the meeting has started, it can't be added to the agenda, it's a non-item. He's not making a ruling, it's a non-item. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, Mr. Chairman, with respect, could I ask that by unanimous consent we add it to the agenda?
You couldn't, because I would not give you unanimous consent, because once the meeting has begun, matters cannot be added to the agenda.
Is it not my understanding from a parliamentary point of view, anything can be added to the agenda by unanimous consent?
Our consultation with the parliamentarian has led us to another position.
I'm sorry, could I ask for clarification from the chairman? I'm not trying to be dilatory, I'm trying to understand. So it is the opinion of the chair or the ruling of the chair that an item cannot be added to an agenda for a business meeting by unanimous consent, even if it's with unanimous consent.
Once the markup has begun, yes, sir.
I thank the chair. I think, Mr. Chairman, I would just say, I think this is a real missed opportunity, and I think it's a dereliction of duty on the part of the committee that we're not looking at the matters I described and the ranking member described. And all I can say is I pray God, come January, this committee will take a much more robust view of its oversight responsibilities. I thank the chair.
Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6891, the Anti-Deficiency Reform and Enforcement Act of 2018. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 6891 to strengthen and enhance the authority to discipline officers and employees of the federal government for violating the Anti-Deficiency Act and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objections to order, I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan and sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Mitchell, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Constitution is very explicit in the separation of powers to guard against the arbitrary use of power by any branch of government. The people granted Congress under Article I the power to write laws, raise revenues, spend and borrow money on behalf of the United States. I believe Article I, the rights of Congress, were put first for a reason, to put the power in the hands of the people. The executive branch and judicial branches have vastly increased their power, sometimes with and sometimes without Congress's consent. This is very dangerous to our Founding Fathers' intent, and I don't believe, regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on, that in fact you disagree. My bill, the Anti-Deficiency Reform and Enforcement Act, will help correct this constitutional imbalance and return appropriate powers to the people's elected representatives by reaffirming Congress's power of the purse and reestablishing and enforcing limits on agency spending authority. The bill prohibits federal agencies from obligating or expending federal funds in advance or in excess of an appropriation, or from accepting voluntary services. Federal employees who violate the ADA are currently subject to 2 types of sanctions, administrative and punitive. Employees may be subject to appropriate discipline, including, when circumstances warrant, suspension from duty without pay or removal from office. In addition, employees may be subject to fines and imprisonment. But there have been almost no instances of prosecutions against individuals in violation of the Act, and no consequences for an agency that's been judged to be deficient. Consequently, there's a need to reinforce the mechanism that is established and provide real consequences to an agency that breaks the law. It is the law. The bill prescribes a range of penalties agencies must take for very serious violations, such as those that are willful or caused by gross negligence. These actions would include suspension or demotion. This bill also requires agencies to terminate employees who knowingly violate the law. Let's stop to think about that. They intend to violate the law because they think the People's House, representatives in Congress, didn't get it right and they know better. This bill also improves the disclosure of violations by requiring the Government Accountability Office to issue legal opinions on potential violations to this committee and the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs of the Senate within 100 days of receiving a congressional request. The bill also requires the Inspectors General to perform periodic reviews to determine whether undisclosed violations may be occurring at their agency. In fact, you will know that in the last 5 years, there are some agencies that had no violations whatsoever. Meanwhile, others, like the Department of Defense, have noted a significant number of them. That disparity is amazing. Finally, the bill incentivizes agencies and employees to uncover and disclose violations by authorizing agencies to provide cash awards to employees who disclose violations. Appropriations restrictions are an important tool for Congress in setting policy, reaffirming the power of the purse, the power of Congress under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. It says simply, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. We put a lot of effort yesterday in the passing an appropriations bill that will, in fact, keep our government funded. Continuing resolution in December for a handful of agencies. It's helpful to make sure that actually the agency follows it. This bill offers an opportunity to reinform and enforce that principle, and I urge its passage. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the Anti-Deficiency Reform and Enforcement Act. With all due respect to Representative Mitchell, the sponsor of the bill, I'm not sure what problem this bill is meant to address. Existing law already prohibits violations of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Federal employees who violate the Act are already subject to administrative and penal sanctions under current law. Penal sanctions include imprisonment, fines, or both. Agencies already have authority under existing law to discipline Federal employees for violations of the Act. Current law gives agencies the flexibility to determine the appropriate penalties to impose on Federal employees depending on the circumstances of each case. These penalties already include suspension without pay or removal. This legislation would take away the agency's discretion to impose the appropriate discipline depending on the facts of each case. This measure would mandate that agencies remove Federal employees if they are found to have knowingly violated the Act or acted in, quote, reckless disregard, end of quote, of whether their actions would have violated the Act. This bill also would require agencies to remove, demote, or suspend employees who fail to, quote, exercise reasonable care, end of quote. This legislation appears to lower the standard of culpability to negligence and recklessness, while at the same time mandating a harsher penalty such as suspension or removal. This raises serious concerns about fairness and due process. When we asked for an explanation as to the motivation underlying the bill, we were told that there was no specific problem that served as the impetus for the legislation, but that the process generally could be improved. Let's look at the facts. Over the last 5 years, there have been an average of 13 total Anti-Deficiency Act violations each year. The data does not justify a need to propose substantial changes to Federal law relating to adverse actions. The bill is a solution in search of a problem. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing H.R. 6891, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? Gentleman from Michigan.
With your indulgence for a moment,
I will claim time and yield it to you inasmuch as you have already exhausted your 5 minutes.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
Courtesy is appreciated. I wish to take a moment to respond to the ranking member's opinion. While I appreciate it and respect it, there have been meaningful violations that we know of, and then the question arises why we've not seen more reporting of violations than we have. Give you a couple of examples. The National Defense Authorization Act in fiscal year 2014 banned the President from using any DoD funds to release prisoners from Guantanamo Bay without giving Congress 30 days' notice. No such notice was given in the Bo Bergdahl case. Thus, the administration committed the DoD funds unauthorized by Congress in excess or advance for amounts that are legally admissible or available. That's a pretty egregious and significant violation when, in this case, the administration decided they knew better than Congress. I'll give you one more example, and then I'll be done, sir. Here's an example. In 2016, it was noted by the Department of Defense that $60 million in change around here, you know, it's all, if it's not a B, I guess it doesn't matter, but $60 million in change was expended, was obligated and expended to reconstruct 137 buildings. The funds were not approved and appropriated. The Army reported that 3 individuals were identified as being responsible. 2 had already left the government by the time they noted, 10 years later, by the way, and 1 was counseled. $60 million. So I believe that while there is a law in the books, it's not been effectively administered, it's not been enforced, and that's why I proposed a bill to actually step up the enforcement and to step up reporting so we, in fact, actually deal with this problem. I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is on favorably reporting H.R. 6891. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recorded vote is ordered. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 6893, the Secret Service Overtime Pay Extension Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 6893 to amend the Overtime Pay for Protective Services Act of 2016 to extend the Secret Service overtime pay exception through 2019 and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma and sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Russell, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the nation's premier protective services agency, the United States Secret Service has a zero-fail mission in protecting the President, the Vice President, and others. Protection is a round-the-clock job, and the Secret Service's historic recruitment and attrition issues have caused excessive overtime work for some agents and uniformed division officers involved in the protective mission. The pay earned for this overtime puts the agents in conflict with the government-wide premium pay cap. An agent or officer who works beyond this pay cap is not compensated for those efforts. For example, as of late July, 924 Secret Service personnel are projected to work enough in 2018 to accrue pay in excess of the cap. The average compensation owed to each individual is approximately $6,300. If the premium pay cap is in effect, the agents and officers do not collect this overtime work and compensation. This phenomenon, known as the max out, has consistently been identified as a leading issue for Secret Service trained agent departure and attrition. Earlier this year, Congress enacted the Secret Service Recruitment and Retention Act. The act extended the pay premium cap waiver, first enacted in 2016, through 2018. The premium pay cap waiver allows Secret Service employees to earn compensation up to level 2 of the executive schedule. The Secret Service has since asked for an additional waiver until their recruitment numbers bridge the gap. In a briefing for committee staff in July, the Secret Service showed progress in its efforts to rectify the hiring and attrition problems. The agency expects net growth of 350 employees in 2018, and attrition is expected to decline to approximately 7.5% for the year. The recruitment improvements will ultimately make extensions of waiver unnecessary, but not for now. I want to publicly acknowledge the effort of Susan Yarwood, Chief Human Capital Officer at the Secret Service, and her employees in working to ensure the necessary human capital improvements are made. As we have maintained, the Secret Service cannot depend on expensive overtime, and the excessive overtime hours have a detrimental effect on agent morale and capacity. As the Secret Service continues to staff up, a one-year extension of the premium pay cap waiver through calendar year 2019 will ensure the agency retains more of its experienced agents by giving them the pay they've earned. It will also give the committee time to receive the GAO report looking at human capital progress at the agency, in addition to other reports required under the Secret Service Recruitment and Retention Act. In total, between 700 and 900 Secret Service personnel will benefit in 2019 under this bill. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This bill would authorize an increase in the annual salary and overtime limit so that the men and women of the Secret Service could receive compensation for the considerable time they will work in 2019. I strongly support this change. I think it is so very important that people be paid for what they do so that they can take care of their families and do the things that they want to do to reach their destiny. The Secret Service needs to have the ability to pay its people for the hours they work in order to attract and retain the best of the best. In 2017, this committee unanimously passed legislation that retroactively funded overtime pay for the thousands of hours of overtime worked by the Secret Service employees during the grueling 2016 presidential campaign year. Last year, the committee unanimously passed and the House approved bipartisan legislation that extended the authorization to 2017 and 2018. The bill was necessary due to the President's unusually large family and constant travel. Secret Service employees deserve, and I emphasize this, deserve to be paid for the overtime they work, period. That is why I introduced a bill with many of my Democratic colleagues that would have provided a permanent fix for this issue by ensuring fair overtime compensation in every presidential campaign year. This is also why I intend to introduce an amendment today that would continue the pay cap extension into 2020 in what we know will be, once again, an incredibly difficult year. And so I support the bill wholeheartedly, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to 68, H.R. 6893, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
First of all, let me say this, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and your staff for working with us with regard to trying to resolve some concerns that I had that are stated pretty much in this amendment. My amendment would authorize an increase in the salary and overtime limit up to level 2 of the executive schedule through the year of 2020. Just last week, Secret Service Director Ailes reached out to me personally to discuss the critical need for legislation covering the 2020 presidential campaign year. He explained that the time is of the essence. In order to prevent a damaging level of attrition, Secret Service agents need to be able to tell their families now that they will be paid for the considerable overtime they will be working in 2020. My position on the Secret Service is the same now as it was under President Obama. Congress needs to adequately fund the Secret Service so it so that it may be able to fulfill its very critical mission of protecting our nation's leaders. And it needs to stop starving the agency, which leads to a vicious cycle of resignations, retirements, and then more overtime for those who stay. I've often said that we've had instances where I think that the morale of the Secret Service was pretty low. And there's nothing like coming home to your wife and telling her, well, honey, I've got to go and work, but I'm not going to get paid. I'm not sure I'm going to get paid. We're much better than that. The men and the women of the Secret Service deserve to be paid for the overtime they work in what we know will be another extremely long, tough 2020 campaign year. No ifs, no ands, no buts. And so I call on my colleagues to join me in supporting this request. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank Mr. Cummings for his hard work the entire time I've been on this committee on this issue. I support his amendment. Does any other member wish to be heard? Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank the ranking member not only for his support of the underlying bill, as well as Ms. Watson-Coleman from New Jersey and Mr. Katko from New York for their support. I do think that the amendment does address a foreseeable underlying issue and will allow the recruitment numbers to take hold in that measure of time. And I thank the ranking member for bringing the amendment.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Question is now on favor of reporting H.R. 6893 as amended to the House of Representatives. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 5759, the 21st Century IDEA Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5759 to improve executive agency digital services and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5759 offered by Mr. Russell.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. Federal Customer Experience Index measures citizen interactions with the federal government. The 2018 index gave federal agencies failing scores. Citizens deserve and expect better from their government. And H.R. 5759, the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act, or the 21st Century IDEA, requires agencies to modernize their websites and digital services. 21st Century IDEA takes a systematic approach to modernizing websites, services, and forms so as not to unduly burden agencies. New and redesigned agency websites will have to meet modernization requirements, such as being searchable, customizable, and secure. Meanwhile, each agency will survey and create a plan for updating its existing websites and digital services, prioritizing those that are used the most by the public. Agencies will also digitize forms so electronic signatures may be used. All these modernization efforts will improve our constituents' experiences when interacting with federal agencies. The bill is supported by the Information Technology Industry Council, the Software Alliance, Adobe, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Software and Information Industry Association, ServiceNow, CompTIA, and Microsoft. I want to thank the chairman and also to Mr. Khanna, the sponsor of the original bill, and Mr. Ratcliffe for introducing the important piece of legislation, and all the co-sponsors on the committee, and I urge my colleagues to support.
The gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. Will now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Chairman, I support the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act, a bill that was introduced by Congressman Ro Khanna and has attracted broad bipartisan support. This bill would require agencies to modernize their public-facing websites and increase the types of services and forms available to the public in a digital form. Improving the capabilities of the agency websites available to the public is essential to ensuring that the Federal Government continues to meet the demands of today's citizens. This bill would help to achieve that goal by requiring agencies to make long overdue improvements to the websites and digital services they provide for the public's benefit. For example, the bill would require that any new or redesigned website be accessible to people with disabilities, offer search functions to allow users to more easily find specific content, and use data-driven analysis to ensure that users' needs are being adequately addressed. I support the bill and yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. The gentlelady from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. As an original co-sponsor of H.R. 5759, the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act, or IDEA Act, I support the efforts of this bill to modernize federal agency websites, support their increased use of mobile devices, and transition away from paper-based forms. This common-sense bipartisan bill will make government more efficient while improving the user experience and increase bureaucratic cost. Building upon my Connected Government Act, this bill will ensure that government websites are accessible with increased security and essential 21st century capabilities like electronic signatures are available. We must, as a government, move away from the paper-based systems and embrace the opportunities of digitalized processing. I want to thank Representative Khanna of California for his leadership on this bill and for pushing to make government more accessible and efficient. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I will.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, since the bill's introduction, I understand there's an amendment in the nature of a substitute that has been drafted that would make certain technical changes to the bill, which I support. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 5759 as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, the committee will now consider bills via unanimous consent. I ask unanimous consent, H.R. 1272, the Cold Case Records Collection Act of 2017, be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives as amended by the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent, H.R. 3154, the Inspector General Access Act of 2017, be favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent, H.R. 6777, the Settlement Agreement Information Database Act of 2018, be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent, H.R. 6901, the Federal CIO Authorization Act of 2018, be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now consider the following postal naming bills in block: H.R. 5791, H.R. 6216, H.R. 6217, H.R. 6428, H.R. 6513, H.R. 6591, H.R. 6621, H.R. 6628, and H.R. 6780. I ask unanimous consent the bills be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, so ordered. Finally, I ask unanimous consent the postal naming bill H.R. 5792 be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives as amended by the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now resume consideration of H.R. 5381. The question is now on the previously postponed amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gowdy.
Aye.
Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Issa. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Sanford. Mr. Amash. Mr. Gosar. Mr. Desjardins. Ms. Fox. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows. Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Comer. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes yes. Mr. Gianforte. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cummings.
No.
Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney. Ms. Norton. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Connolly. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence. Ms. Watson-Coleman. Mr. Krishnamurthy. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Welch. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Desaulniers. Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Sarbanes.
The gentlelady from North Carolina.
Ms. Fox.
The gentleman from California.
Ms. Fox votes yes.
The gentleman,
Mr. Issa votes yes.
the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Comer votes yes.
The gentleman
Mr.
from
Chairman.
Vermont.
Mr. Welch
The
votes
gentleman
no.
from Virginia.
Mr. Connolly votes no.
Mr. Chairman. Texas.
The gentleman from the great state of Texas.
Yes.
Mr. Cloud votes yes.
The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Grothman votes yes.
gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no.
The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 13 ayes and 7 noes.
The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 5381 as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Committee will now resume consideration of H.R. 6891. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 6891. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gowdy?
Aye.
Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Sanford? Mr. Amash? Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjardins? Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. Ross? Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Blum? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes yes. Mr. Gianforte? Mr. Cloud? Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Cummings?
No.
Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Norton? Mr. Clay? Mr. Lynch? Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly? Mr. Connolly votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Oh, Ms. Lawrence votes no. Ms. Watson-Coleman? Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Gomez? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett? No. Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
The gentleman from Maryland, Professor Raskin.
Mr. Raskin votes no.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Ms. Norton votes no.
The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Oh, wait a minute, hold on. Hey. One more. Two more.
Clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 14 ayes and 11 noes.
The gentleman from Maryland, had he been, would have been recorded as a no. Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania would have been recorded as a no. The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I think that's it for the day. I do want to thank all the members. I realize there are a lot of things going on competing for your time, so appreciate your presence today and always. I ask unanimous consent staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill's order reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. There's no further business. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.